Bryan, would you like to say a few words?
Does this work? Yes. We face a serious educational crisis in the world today. The crisis is that the rest of the world understands the West, the civilization, the literature, the religions, the philosophy of the West, much better on average than the West understands the rest of the world. To put it in a simple slogan, the rest understands the West better than the West understands the rest. So in my remarks today, I'd like to say something about how we got into this situation and what we can do to get out of it. Now, if you look back at European philosophy textbooks as late as the 18th century, there were three common views about how philosophy originated in the world. One of the common views in European philosophy textbooks up through the 18th century was that philosophy originated in Africa. And from Africa, philosophy was given as a gift to the Greek world. A second major view was that philosophy began in India, and from India, philosophy migrated to ancient Greece. Now, I'm sure you all can imagine what the third major view was about the origin of philosophy. It was that philosophy developed independently in both India and Africa, and both of them gave it to ancient Greece. The view that philosophy began independently in ancient Greece, much less that it began uniquely in ancient Greece, was considered a weird fringe view in European philosophy as late as the 18th century. So, given this open-minded attitude, it's no surprise that when people first learned about Chinese philosophy, they were very receptive to it and very excited about it. The sayings of Confucius and his immediate disciples are called in English the Analects, in Chinese the Lunyu, and the first translation of the sayings of Confucius into a European language was done by Jesuit missionaries. And the Jesuits have extensive familiarity with Western philosophy as part of their training. And they translated the sayings of Confucius into Latin with the title Confucius Sonorum Philosophus, Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, because they immediately recognized that Confucianism was philosophic and very interesting philosophy at that. It wasn't just the Jesuits who were excited about Confucianism as a philosophy. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who appears on any standard history of modern Western philosophy curriculum, was a true Sinophile. And in fact, he said that Confucian ethics were better than Western ethics. He added, though it is shameful for us to admit this. He said that Confucian ethics are more suited to the life of mortals like us, as opposed to the less realistic Western ethics. Leibniz was also fascinated because Leibniz, of course, invented binary arithmetic, which is the basis of computers. So the next time you use a computer, thank a philosopher. You're welcome. But Leibniz, when he learned about the I Ching, the classic of changes, the Chinese divination and philosophy text that describe situations using hexagrams, collections of 6 broken or unbroken lines, Leibniz recognized broken and unbroken lines are essentially zeros and ones. And he said, my God, they invented binary arithmetic before I did. Well, given all the excitement about Chinese philosophy, obviously Chinese philosophy continued to be a standard part of the Western philosophy curriculum up to the present day. No, it didn't. Why not? The simple answer, I'm afraid, is Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant was undeniably a brilliant philosopher, and in some ways I consider myself a Kantian, and many people have found emancipatory ideas in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And Kant certainly did not invent the notion of pseudo-scientific racism, but he bought into it once he discovered it. It's not as well known because he doesn't write about it mostly in his more well-known works, but in his lectures, he ranked the races hierarchically, with whites at the top. Whites, Kant informs us, contain all talents and motives in themselves. And so they are the only race capable of philosophy. And you'll have to pardon my language here, but I'm just repeating what Kant said. Sometimes we have to look at ugly things to confront them. Kant said, Hindus look like philosophers, but they are incapable of abstract thought, and so will never achieve science or philosophy. Obviously, Kant had never read a single work of Indian philosophy, or he'd know better, or Indian science for that matter. Kant said the Chinese are on the same level as the, again, pardon my language, the Hindus, because their own books tell us that they have not advanced a single bit beyond what their sages came up with thousands of years ago. The Africans, Kant tells us, are, Kant's language, chatty and vain, and can only be trained to be servants. And he said the indigenous people of the America, according to Kant, don't talk and are infertile, a claim which on the face of it has to be false of the human beings who occupied the Americas before Europeans came in. Now, you might say, okay, so Kant's he was a racist, but we don't read those works anymore. Who cares? The reason we should care is that Kant was a great philosopher who transformed Western philosophy, and his disciples rewrote the philosophy textbooks in Europe. And they wrote Asia, Africa, and the indigenous traditions of the America out of the philosophy textbooks. Now, the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of my colleagues in philosophy would reject the explicit racism of Kant's account. But they accept the tainted fruit of Kant's account, which is the unargued assumption that there never was any philosophy in any tradition besides the tradition that goes back to Plato and Aristotle. And just a quick digression on this point, occasionally my colleagues in philosophy will say, well, Bryan, why do you have to bring racism into this? You know, what do you think it's about racism? Isn't it just about ignorance? I can't tell you how many times I have said to people things like, have you considered hiring someone in Chinese philosophy? And they say, well, there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy. And I ask them, well, what have you read that is considered Chinese philosophy that you disagree is philosophy? And they say, oh, I haven't read any, but I just know there isn't any. And I know the same things happens with Indian philosophy, with African philosophy, with indigenous American philosophy. People feel they don't have to read it. They know a priori it doesn't exist. That is why this is about structural racism. So what's been the effect of Kant? There are only about 13% of the doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States. Is there anybody on staff who can competently supervise a dissertation on Chinese philosophy? And there is not a single Ivy League university that has anyone in its philosophy department capable of supervising a dissertation on Chinese philosophy. Now, the situation of Indian philosophy is a little more complicated. Here at Columbia, it's one of the few doctoral programs in philosophy where you can actually study Indian philosophy. They have an assistant professor, I hope they tenure her someday, who covers Indian philosophy. But overall, there are fewer places where you can study South Asian or Indian philosophy in the United States than there are places where you can study Chinese philosophy. African philosophy, about in the same boat as Indian philosophy. My friend Ricardo Pazzo mentioned Kwasi Wiredu, who passed away just a few years ago. He was one of the few scholars in the United States teaching African philosophy, and he's passed away. As for indigenous American philosophy, last time I checked, there were 3 doctoral programs where you could study the thought of the people who lived in the Americas before the Europeans came in. So what can we do about this? Well, I wrote a book, Taking Back Philosophy, and I argued in this book, if you liked some of the documentation for the claims I've just made or some quick responses to some of the tedious and fallacious arguments against teaching Chinese or African or indigenous American or South Asian philosophy in philosophy departments, I talk about that in Taking Back Philosophy. But in the book, I say we need to take back philosophy in two senses. We need to take back philosophy to the cosmopolitan ideal that originally motivated philosophy. Plato knew there were interesting ideas in other cultures and he wanted to learn about them. Most people knew this until the beginning of the modern era. So we need to take philosophy back to its cosmopolitan roots, its cosmopolitan and multicultural roots. Also, I think we should take philosophy back to its roots as something concerned with philosophy as a way of life. Too often, especially in the English-speaking world, philosophy has become a bunch of intellectual parlor games where people are willing to fight to the death over the question of whether the sentence, "the current king of France is bald," is false or neither true nor false. I have a colleague from graduate school who wrote a whole book about that. I'm not making that up. This is a real thing philosophers like to argue about instead of the meaning of life. And when you think about philosophy in a cosmopolitan way and about the meaning of life, what you recognize is that there are four topics that people discuss across many, many civilizations. What is the right way to live? What is the best way of life? In English, we technically refer to that as human flourishing. And in Chinese, you would refer to it as ren dao, the way of a human. Or in ancient Greek, you'd refer to it as eudaimonia. Or in Latin, you'd refer to it as beatitudo, similar concept across different cultures. How they fill that concept out is often different, but they're interested in that topic. And if you care about ways of life, then you're also going to care about the personality traits, the character traits you need to live that way of life. In English, we call those virtues. In Chinese, they call them de, or in modern Chinese, mei de. In Greek, they call them arete. And in Latin, they call them virtu. And if you care about virtues, you have to care about how you cultivate the virtues. And in English, we just call that ethical cultivation. In Chinese, you could say shouyang. In Greek, you'd say paideia. And in Latin, you'd say humanitas. And of course, if you're caring about cultivating virtues so you can live a way of life, you care about what is human nature like, so that it's possible to live that way of life and cultivate those virtues. And we talk about human nature in English, which comes from the Latin natura, which is their version of the Greek physis, and in Chinese you talk about renxing, human nature. So we find different answers to common questions, and in an interconnected, multipolar world, we need to understand what other people think on these topics and not just deal in memes or caricatures of what they think. Now, if you'd like some concrete recommendations about how to make education multicultural, when the G7 nations met recently in Italy, they called together a group of leading philosophers and me to, glad you laughed at that, to develop a statement on the needs of philosophy going forward. And we wrote in the city of Barletta, the Barletta Declaration on Philosophy and Interculturality. And you can find it on my website, bryanvannorden.com. That's BRYANVANNORDEN.com. Sorry, I'm misspelling it, but for some reason people find my name incredibly difficult to spell. I don't mind, but you won't find the web. But if you just looked up Barletta Declaration, it should take you to my website. I also have links there to syllabi and readings for different kinds of philosophy. So I'd like to end with an anecdote that I think kind of illustrates, and I say the Barletta Declaration will give you some concrete suggestions for how to achieve multicultural philosophy. But I'd like to end on an anecdote. There's a European university that had a bit of controversy recently. This European university, there was this young upstart philosopher who wanted to introduce a new figure to the philosophical curriculum. And a lot of the conservatives on the faculty said, well, this guy is not a part of our tradition, and you're watering down the curriculum with all these non-canonical thinkers and texts. Students literally almost rioted about this change in the curriculum. The university I'm talking about is the University of Paris. The debate I'm talking about took place in the 13th century. The young upstart philosopher was St. Thomas Aquinas, and he was trying to introduce Aristotle back into the European philosophical curriculum because his works had been lost, but fortunately preserved in the Islamic world. And now they were being translated into Latin. And by the way, there's some evidence that Aquinas only worked from Latin translations of Aristotle's works. And there are plenty of translations of Indian and Chinese and African and indigenous American philosophy. And for me, what's really exciting about Thomas Aquinas is that Aquinas was someone who had his own Christian faith, but he wanted to learn from pagans like Plato and Aristotle. He wanted to learn from Jews like Maimonides. He wanted to learn from Muslims like Avicenna and Averroes. And he recognized that respecting his own tradition was completely consistent with loving and learning from other traditions as well. And that approach, the way I would summarize that is to use lines from the great Latin poem Terence, who, and this is an English translation, of course, Terence said, "I am a human, and nothing human is alien to me." Or, as Kongzi's disciple Zi Sha said, "Si hai zhi nei, jie shong di ye." Within the four seas, all are brothers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bryan. Your talk is always very interesting. I would like to open the discussion to the audience. If you have any question, feel free to raise your hands, and our staff there will deliver the microphone to you if you have any question.
Should I now ask my question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm also a philosopher, and I've been honored to join Jeff and Philo and Bryan and most of the panel on the trips that Philo mentioned. I want to share two brief anecdotes, and then I have a question. So I started this startup community engagement project a few years ago called Philosophy in the Schools New Haven, where I go into public schools and when they'll let me, when I can get past the bureaucracy, and I give lectures and discussions on philosophy. And they're really well received. The kids absolutely love them because they've never been able to think like that before in the way that public schools work in the United States. The second anecdote is I was teaching virtue ethics at a big state public institution where I teach last week, and after I was going on and on about virtue ethics, a student raised their hand and said, "Well, what does virtue mean?" And so I see a real problem here that students are not learning about any of this stuff. I mean, we're talking about traditions and depth of traditions and really understanding traditions, but at least in the United States where we're sitting right now, most students don't have an opportunity to learn about any tradition until they're quite of age, unless they have a family or religious tradition that allows them. So since we have this beautiful panel with representatives from different countries, and maybe other countries have educational systems that are different, and we had a wonderful panel on the global schools yesterday, and I see the last panels on the youth. So my question is, and let's not forget that for Aristotle, character education starts very young, or else it's not possible. So how can we change our educational system in the United States to perhaps be a support, for this kind of multilateral global ethics that we're even trying to imagine?
Bryan? Yeah?
I got to solve that problem? Okay. No, that's an excellent question. I've had the same experience. I've gotten to the point where when we start talking about virtue ethics, I explain what virtues are. And I point out, I think part of the problem is the term virtue has an archaic ring in modern English. And so if you talk about virtue, usually people think it has something to do with sexuality primarily, and that they don't realize it relates to other aspects of a person's character. But I try to, that's why I like this framework I came up with, where I said, look, you have a conception of what it is to live well, right? You might think you don't, but that's because you're thinking of a very narrow notion of, say, what it is to be a super moral person. And you say, well, I don't care about that. But you have some idea of what you think your life would look like if it turned out well. Maybe you think it's just to be rich. Okay, that's your conception of living well. I think it's a shallow conception of living well, and I hope I can show you in the course why it's shallow, but it's a conception of what it is to live well. And then you're going to need character traits to succeed in what you think is living well. The exercise of those character traits will be necessary to live well. Virtues is just a fancy name for those character traits you need to live well. And unless you're incredibly lucky, and 99.9% of us are not, you're going to have to cultivate those character traits. That's ethical cultivation. And your view of what it is to live well and your view of what character traits you're going to need to live well and how you cultivate them had better make sense out of given whatever you think human nature is. So guess what? You have a view of what it is to live well, what human flourishing is, what the virtues are, what ethical cultivation is, and what human nature is before you even walked into this philosophy class. Let's look at what some smart people thought were good answers to these questions, and you can decide how to incorporate that into your own conception. So that's how I motivate it with my students. I know it's not a complete answer, but that's how I address that in my class. Do you want to say anything, Jeff, or Katja?
I wanna give the microphone to Cisco. Would you like to share some of your insight on this question?
Thanks, Philo. I was just actually typing up a comment in, corresponding with Abigail, since she's the person we see on our side here. So I've worked in the United States for quite a bit, actually, with a couple of colleagues in graduate schools in education who are also thinking about teacher education and how that, how teacher education programs in the United States affect or impact the public school system in the United States. And there's a very interesting sort of reality that one sort of brushes up against in those very spaces, which is what Bryan was talking about, where the world knows a ton about the United States, and the United States knows nothing about the world. And so what often happens in those conversations where people are like, oh, we're open to learning, we're open to finding out different ways of doing things, is that those of us who come from marginal spaces are often sort of, I don't want to put this, crudely, but we're often sort of sidelined in those conversations. And yet we know how the public education systems work in the context of the United States. Some of those systems have actually been brought into our own contexts. They failed, and we have had to revise the kind of policy positions that we have held in our own contexts as a result of it. And we sort of attempt to bring that knowledge in, but that sort of cross-context pollination doesn't often happen because people who are in charge of teacher education programs, education revision, policy revision programs, as well as making a dent on the public system in the education space in the United States, are often not as willing to hear from folks who are coming from outside. But in our own context, I'll just say, something very simple. And I've written about this quite extensively, actually, about sort of acknowledging the kind of knowledge, or the experiential knowledge that students bring into our classrooms, and to allow students to tap into that as part and parcel, what again Bryan is talking about, which is to say you have a conception of what it means to live a good life, even though that conception might be bogged down by certain sociocultural ideas and sociocultural definitions of what living good sort of seeks to suggest. I think that there are those two parts. It's to acknowledge students as agential knowers in our own spaces, but secondly, to try and really deepen this cross-cultural, cross-border conversation that facilitates multilateralism. Because, as I say, there's often this kind of resistance when those of us are coming into the system because we are assumed not only to be unknowing, but if you go back to V.Y. Mudimbe's The Invention of Africa, we are assumed to be gradual, to be backward, and to be retarded. And I apologize if the language is a bit too strong, but fundamentally, that is the logic of colonialism, that is the logic of imperialism. Thanks, Philo.
Thank you. Ricardo, I know you want to share a few things with us as well, and we still have questions in the audience. Could you please quickly share with us, and we make sure we can still get the question.
Very short on Bryan and on what the gentleman of artist said. Well, I wanted to say we have started. The global philosophy, the global history of philosophy curriculum has started. Habermas has started it with a new book, and even older institutions like the Überweg Grundgeschichte Philosophie, they consider each tradition. And if you think of what we did at the World Congress of Philosophy, I was in the program committee, we were maniacal strict that in each plenary panel, all traditions were presented, especially the marginalized one. So we try to give word to everybody. And if you want, the question is, again, for the gentleman of artists, why should the executive be interested? Well, so far, and this is also what happened in the World Congress, philosophers have interpreted the word in various ways. They still have to show that we are going to change it. They need to have proposals that change the situation we are in. And so that philosophers now work for the Agenda 2050 is beautiful. It's what they have to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more question in the back of the audience.
No, thank you very much for what very wonderful and insightful sessions. And I would take it from the angle of the link between philosophy and development. I think back in the 80s, it was so important that UNESCO actually was pushing such an agenda. And then it permeated the development world to the point where in the World Bank at some point, what they call immersion program, where to actually be a good country economist, you had to go and live in certain communities to really understand where they were coming from. But I was very enlightened by this conversation, but also came out of very concerned, because if, in essence, the philosophy are the most enlightened of the community, and then from what Bryan said in terms of even the biases, entrenched biases that we are still dealing with today in the 21st century, then what does that tell us about what we are trying to do in moving toward a better world? How do we bridge that? And my view is that it's important to actually move to what I call the collective imaginary, that we are on the same plane to be able to move much rapidly. And we need a philosopher to do that, but what I'm hearing is very disheartening, quite frankly. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
One more question back here.
So once again, congratulations. It's fantastic. The panel is fantastic, and the ideas. I'm from Romania. By origin, I'm a Crimean Tatar. I'm also practitioner Muslim. And I would like to tell you the moment when I got the answer to these aspects, when I had the chance of having an audience with Pope Francis in Rome. So, of course, everything, in my opinion, without being a philosopher, I think is anthropogenic. Because at the end, everything is reflected on ourselves. But then we have this option of these multiple choices. And among these multiple choices, what Pope Francis advised was, first of all, look into your inside and think and try to understand if the choice is in resonance with yourself, with your soul. So I think at the end, we are human beings. We are not machines or, let's say, artificially intelligent tools. We have a soul, and the reality that we are building is anthropogenic, but we have to consider it in resonance with our feelings. What is your opinion? How philosophy is answering to this?
I'm happy to say just sort of one sentence, because I realize we want to wrap up. Maybe the answer of sort of looking to the inside is one of the few common denominators between any number of different philosophical traditions. That this kind of reflection, even asking questions like, what is virtue? Maybe your student actually became a philosopher through your teaching and was able to ask, what is that to be virtuous? That is maybe a really good thing, that that kind of question is being asked, and it could be part of looking to the inside, asking yourself, what is really important to me? What is it to be a good person? And so on and so forth. And I would argue that those types of questions are maybe where different outlooks can meet and agree that those are questions we all want to ask and need to ask.
Let me just add, it's a wonderful panel, and everybody is engaged in it, and this discussion does not happen in the UN Security Council. It does not happen at the G20. It does not happen among world leaders. It does not happen among generals. This is a very serious problem, which is that we are not having a philosophical discussion about the kind of world that we want among people who are determining our lives and deaths. And that, I think, is extremely pertinent and serious. There has been no philosophical discussion about the war in Gaza. There has been no philosophical discussion about the war in Ukraine among the people who are dropping the bombs or choosing whether to drop the bombs or to find a different way or to find a different approach. And this, to me, is why this discussion is also extremely pertinent. Of course, it's pertinent for our children. It's pertinent for how we live. It's pertinent for how we hope young people will live and learn, because they're going to be in a very diverse and global world. But we're also at a point of, as the doomsday clock says, 90 seconds to midnight, and we don't have the most basic appreciation of other societies, and don't even know that we don't, and don't even know how to get it. So there are assumptions made every day here about what the Chinese are going to do so that we can have a war by 2027, says the US Navy. This is insanity. And this is the level of stupidity, I'll use a harsh word, but that we really are governed by right now. Now, one of the things and by the way, just the list of issues that came up that are philosophical issues as well as economic or political or sociological or any other category: migrants, marginalized populations, post-colonial populations, clash of civilizations, future generations, relations to the biosphere. These are all intrinsically deeply philosophical issues that are not so much discussed in a philosophical way in places where it needs to be. One of the things as I studied more and more philosophy, one of the things that I came to love about philosophy is that the great philosophers that we know of were not sitting in classrooms. They're all failed politicians, almost all of them. Or even better, from my point of view, failed policy advisors. I love the fact that Plato failed 3 times in trying to advise the Syracusa in Sicily, because if he can fail, it gives us license for all of us to fail. One of the times he was nearly arrested and sold off to slavery, but he escaped at the last moment, so I'm just trying to take notes. Well, I was going to say that Confucius spent his whole life up to age 70 going from kingdom to kingdom, being ignored, basically. Until he sat down with his disciples and then taught for the next 2,000 years what to do. But during his lifetime, he was mostly ignored. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as basically a job application to get the job back with the Medici. Locke, these are not all my favorites, but because they wrote for patrons, the Earl of Shaftesbury in that case, and he was secretary for the Carolinas. And John Stuart Mill worked for 40 years for the East India Company. I don't think he got a lot right out of that particular part of his career. But the idea is we need to bring this discussion in a very practical way also, in a rather urgent way. And it's very, very rich. And our assumptions about how others behave are very culturally determined by our own views. I think one of the things Pope Francis teaches the most, by the way, is what his encyclical Fratelli Tutti is about, and that is encounter. And the idea is that if you really want a philosophical approach, listen to the other and know how to make that encounter. And that encyclical is dedicated, it's the first ever, I think, Catholic papal encyclical dedicated to a Muslim leader. It's dedicated to the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. And it opens actually with a description of St. Francis of Assisi, and this is a historical truth, traveling on foot basically in ship to Damietta, Egypt, in the Fifth Crusade in 1219 to meet with the Sultan Kamil al-Malik to try to make peace between the Christians and the Muslims on the battlefield. And he had an all-night discussion with the Sultan. Peace did not come in that way, but it was another encounter that was extraordinary. So I want to thank all the panelists and all the philosophers, and Jian Yu, a colleague on our practical side of things, but philosophical in his own right, for how rich this is, how meaningful it is, how important it is, and how much we have to really propel it into active political discourse as well, because this is not only philosophical, to put it in quotation marks, this is the most practical, and that's how philosophy has always been. That was the tradition, practical, and we need it practically speaking today more than ever. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will give the stage to our colleagues. Thank you very much. And I also think we should give an applause for ourselves, because we listened to 1.5 hours of philosophy. And let's be honest, that doesn't happen all the time. So, yeah.
So, Yasmine Sherif. So I follow her on LinkedIn a lot, and it's very few LinkedIns I wouldn't like, you know. That's, you know, so that says something. So she's the Executive Director of Education Can't Wait. And yeah, given time constraints, I'm going to let you go first. Yeah, go first.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's working. I mean, usually I speak very loud anyway. I could speak without the microphone. Just a compliment. But first of all, I must thank everyone organizing this amazing conference, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs in person. I told him I read every article he writes. I mean, I just get it in my inbox and I cannot stop reading it, because there are very few voices like that out there. And it is what I call intellectual honesty. Intellectual honesty. And just being here, listening to all of you, I just feel so inspired. Wow, there's hope in this world. Oh, academia. Yeah, because I'm in the UN. Academia has to answer. I used to be in academia myself, but I've been in the UN for a long time. So I am the ex-director of Education Cannot Wait. We're a global fund for education in emergencies and crisis. That was created by the former Prime Minister of the UK, UN Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, at the World Humanitarian Summit. And the reason we were created was that education is sort of a development basic investment. And so often in humanitarian crisis, and you mentioned Gaza, Ukraine, well, the crisis now, you stop counting them. There are so many across the globe, the Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Afghanistan. I can't forget the continent, across the Middle East, that I think, sadly, with all the sources or or region of philosophy that comes from that part of the world is now in tatters. With so many crises and humanitarian responses, education was never prioritized. So the average investment in education, when you have a crisis like this that will last not 2 years or 1 year, but you look at Afghanistan, that's been going on since the late 70s actually. When people say it started in 81 or so, no, they're wrong. I was there in 1990, and then it had been just concluded the first peace agreement, which did not last. It started with the invasion in the late 70s. So you look at Democratic Republic of Congo. I was just watching a movie when I went to Sweden. I'm half Swedish. Recently by Dag Hammarskjöld. I mean, he was out there in the 50s, 60s. Congo DRC did not start last year. We're speaking protracted crisis, generation after generation after generation losing out on an education. So that's why we were created. And today we have mobilized close to $2 billion, and we have invested in over 40 countries or regions or contexts where education, to give it a stronger, we advocate for that, to give it a stronger, a minimum of 10 to 20% of both the humanitarian and the development budget. So that's the background. We are a very fast-moving initiative in the UN system, and I think maybe because we are not part of UN Security Council. If we were, we would not exist. But we are a very non-political humanitarian development entity hosted by UNICEF, serving the whole UN and civil society, but most of all, the ministers of education. Since Ghana is stable, and I've been to Ghana, it's a lovely country, we aren't in Ghana. I'm sorry, you don't need us there. But we are across all countries where you have great ministers of education, but you just don't, you're working with an abnormal situation of armed conflict or climate-induced disaster, or you're hosting an enormous amount of refugees. Uganda has the biggest number of refugees in Africa, in the world, I guess. Pakistan, the same. Gaza, I don't have words anymore how to explain, because as Philippe Lazzarini said, the whole education system has been decimated. It doesn't even exist. Or Ukraine, where we started investing in 2017, well before the international community understood that Ukraine was the children of Ukraine were lacking out on education as a result of what was happening in the borders, or the girls in Afghanistan who have now been banned for the 3rd year from attending school beyond 6th grade. I mean, the cruelty, the lack of empathy, the lack of an understanding of what global responsibility means, the lack of peace building is probably the most urgent issues of our time. And that's why I believe we say that digitalization is important. Well, let me first say, because of the social inequity between the North and the South, there is no infrastructure in many of these countries to even have Wi-Fi. So that goes back to equity in how we distribute the resources around the globe. To go out in Mali, in the middle of nowhere, and say, here you have, iPad, learn. The issues are much bigger and broader than this. We are speaking about an absolute social inequity on a planet where we have so many resources available. This is a wealthy planet, but it's not managed with responsibility or moral responsibility. And that's where the problem is. And that's where philosophy comes in. And I used to do philosophy before I did human rights law. And I think the philosophy is probably one of my most fascinating subjects, but it ties you to human rights law as well. It sort of builds into one another. I think philosophy, peace building, ethics, and ethical politics, empathy, responsibility for, in a sense of solidarity for the world, These are the things that the new generation needs in their classroom. These are the things we need to put at the top of their curriculum. Because if life is just about getting rich, but not having wealth inside you, you're really poor. It doesn't matter how much money you have, okay? And if you are having a great, comfortable life where there are children without limbs, without parents, I wouldn't be able to say I'm happy when I come home with my bad grades. So I think it is we need to revive. Today, everything is about an attention span of 20 seconds on Twitter. It's not the philosophical thinking when you really sit down like the ancient Greeks and ask yourself, know thyself, which is the old Greek ancient axiom, where you study yourself, you study your environment, you try to connect the dots, and there's a strong sense of morality and ethics and virtue. And I noted that virtue was being discussed. And I think it's very important when we discuss virtue and morality, because we are living in this world with many different religions, many different ethnicities, and no one has monopoly over any righteousness over the other. And I was very lucky to grow up in Sweden where religion was a subject. So we learned about all world religions and offsprings of different major religions. So I don't have a problem. But I know people have problems with religion. And they make it a huge issue to the extent that they can go and kill for it. Anyway, so I think these are where we need to focus. Change first of all, take responsibility so that everyone has availability of an infrastructure that gives them the digital learning. But as Martin Luther King said, we have advanced technically, but we haven't advanced spiritually. Go back, focus on philosophy, peace building, open up to learn about different cultures, different religions, teach tolerance. Because we know that those that are at war today, and that's not just one part of the globe as opposed to another. As a matter of fact, there is one part of the globe where trillions of dollars are invested in war. And then a few $100 million are invested in education for the rest of the globe. It is, if they invested all those trillions of dollars instead of in the killing machinery, in education for everybody, and we wouldn't have the differences that you mentioned between European countries and countries in Africa, we could restore digital learning, but it is the subjects of empathy, compassion, ethics, ethical politics, responsibility. We need a change of consciousness in the new generation. They are our hope. It's the young people that are our hope. It's very difficult to teach an old dog to sit. Thank you.
Yeah.
Aloha Velina Kako. My name is Kino Hisuki, and I'm a 15-year-old from Hawaii. I am a student at Kamehameha Schools. I'm a sophomore in high school, as well as a member of the SDG Youth Council. And, I've heard a lot about, philosophy, policy, and science scores, but I want to know, where does culture and where do values tie into this type of curriculum?
Okay, so let's go then.
I would like you. Yeah. I mean, I think going backward, I think it was a very important question raised by our friend from Hawaii. And it's about culture and education. And that takes us also back to human rights. And I always say, if you really want to make sure that people don't access the human rights or get a tool to access the human rights or stand up for the human rights or know their culture, make sure that they don't get an education. That's the best way to repression. Or to use culture to destroy another culture. Cultural identity is so important. It's part of a child's development. But it's also important, and that's why human rights are so important, and that's why I think it goes back to value system. What is virtue? Human rights are virtue. You can be whoever you want. You can relate to universe whatever way you want, as you don't hurt another human being. And I think that's the bottom line of virtues, the right to respect culture, religion, and so forth. So that's a very important question, because we know that the destruction of culture is also about destroying people and their history. I want to say something very quickly about the costs of education. Do you choose education, or how was raised by our colleague from UK over there? I think there are two levels of this. One is globally, what do we do with the resources that exist? And the UN came out with a report a couple of years ago. The $2.1 trillion go into the war machinery. $2.1 trillion in 2022, I think. It's probably gone up much more now. And at Education Cannot Wait, we are really happy that we have raised 1.8 billion and to cover 224 million children, and we have reached 11 million only so far. What is that compared to $2.1 trillion? So at international level, how are you making your decisions on where we investing as a human family? And that's very important, because I often see in my work, and here I have to be, I often see the international aid community going to the ministers of education in Africa and the Middle East. Oh, you have to invest more in education. And then comes the minister of education in Chad. Yeah, but I need to make sure we have safe border, because we have a lot of wars around there, and we have massive amount of refugees coming. And if I don't safeguard some security here, the refugees cannot feel safe here. The problem is not the ministers of education in the global south, or even sometimes their own whole of government approach. The problem is that so many wars are created on the continent that security becomes a survival mechanism. So I do always put the responsibility, and I've had these discussions many times, discussing many wars and conflicts in the Middle East and Africa. The strongest one is the one that must first bend and take responsibility. Don't go to the ones who are the victims of your neocolonialism, the victims of your deprivation of their minds and DRC, and tell them how to behave. What is your role in this? So I think at Education Cannot Wait, we are just there to serve the Minister of Education in all these countries. And if others want to remind them that they should invest more in education, we remind them they should invest less in wars to create these problems for the Global South. Thank you.
I just want to make a quick comment about the benchmarks for financing and the returns to education. It is a commonplace in economic growth analytics that the returns to education are enormously high. They take 25 years to realize, or 30 years to realize. You take a young child, you have to put the child through university. That's the aim. And the returns, if you calculate it, are typically above 20% compound annual rate of return. So the argument is not whether this is a good economic investment. It is an investment outside of the politician's electoral cycle. But it is the highest return that society has, actually. It's better than investing in Apple or Amazon or others. It's more than 20% compound return. It's the only way that a society can develop, the only way. Now, all of our benchmarks are wrong, like 15% of the budget or 20% of the budget or 4% of GDP or 5% of GDP. It all depends on how many children in the population, what is the cost of teachers relative to the average salary, and what is the infrastructure needs. If you do it that way rather than a slogan, you might end up with 10 to 15% of GDP, not of the budget. So you might end up at 50% of the budget or 75% of the revenues. What's the implication of that? Not that it's impossible or you've done the calculation wrong, but that you may need to finance a significant increment in another way, like a 40-year low-interest loan, for example. A 40-year low-interest loan for education is an excellent investment. If it's 40 years so you don't get stuck in a debt trap in 5 years or 10 years, the child's only going to be in 10th grade by then. They're not going to be boosting the government revenues. But if you give 40 years, you've got a completely new economy on your hands. This is what has been rejected or not analyzed by the gatekeepers, say the IMF or the World Bank gatekeepers who do the debt sustainability. They don't have a 40-year framework. They literally have a 10-year framework. I don't mean figuratively, I mean literally. They cannot compute the benefits of education financing with the tools that they use because they're asking the question about the debt ratio 5 to 10 years. So unless we understand this is the best investment, but it's a long-term investment, and we have to tell the politicians it's a long-term investment, you will have the monument to you in 50 years. You may not win re-election, but you will have the monument to you for having created the modern economy. And what we need to tell the parents is this is the best thing that can happen for your children, because there's no path out of poverty for your children, even for your children to support you in your old age, unless they're educated in the 21st century economy. And one of the brilliant things about the East Asian economies, all of whom are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the top of the PISA scale, is that the parents are going mad for their kids' education. This is really so essential. And so this is another part of the story. This isn't a nice thing or a burden. Oh, we got to send the kid to school for another 4 years because the president said so. This is the best thing that can happen to the family. So I think we just need this understanding very deeply, and we need also to, when you're on these committees, tell them they don't even do the arithmetic right, and if they want my spreadsheet, I'll share it with them. Really, and the other thing I would really like is that every single country should be in PISA, because we need the standardized assessments all over the world, because what Andreas has created is monumentally good and important. And when you get a low score, it's a lesson. It's not a punishment. It's a spur. And I was just in Mexico. They didn't like their low scores, so they canceled being part of PISA for a while. I don't know if they're back or not. They're back. But, you know, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is to say, oh, I came out at the bottom. We need to double our budget. We need to change the curriculum. So my goal is that all 193 UN member states are part of PISA as soon as we can possibly do that.
I think this is the closing remarks. So powerful. But the only thing is the PISA. One of the things that Ghana, we preparing to go to PISA. But I also realized that we have to look at our local assessment regime. Invariably, we think that in education we have what we call CIA, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So we do that so well. But what we fail to understand is that assessment comes first. The outcome that you want, the product the student have to create. You are looking at how to solve certain mathematical equations. Then you work your way backwards to look at, is the curriculum covering that, and how am I going to teach it? About 6 months ago, I had a meeting with the West Africa Examination Council. They are the one who examine all students in Anglophone West Africa. And people see them as an international organization. But I called them to my office and I said, we have a new curriculum at the junior high school level. Give me a table of specification. as to the level of difficulty of the questions that are going to come on this exam. So I popped up on my screen in my office the new Bloom's taxonomy, and I took them through it. The level 1, which is remembering, on a particular subject, 20 of the questions out of 40 were on remembering. Understanding had 10 questions. So that gives you, between understanding and remembering, have 30 questions out of 40. And application was 10. Nothing on the exams was coming from level 4, 5, and 6. So what did that mean? What it meant, it would have meant for the country was that the following year, the teachers were not going to use critical thinking. They will not have to design lesson plans at 4, 5, and 6, because the exams is just level 1, 2, and 3. So I told them, you go back. And I said, this is a case where the tail is wagging the dog. We have created a national curriculum that says we will have critical thinkers. And as I've even gone to United Nations to talk about, we can't memorize our way out of poverty, but we can critically think. and this has gone viral. Then in my own country, there's nothing critical thinking about exams. So they took it back, and they came back 2 weeks thereafter. Now I was so happy, because 40% of the questions were from level 4, 5, and 6, assuring me that nobody was going to get an A if they could not think. But they were shocked that the education minister said the question should be difficult. But I also felt the investment we are making in education is to produce critical thinkers. And if our system is not producing them, our education is worthless. So now I'm so happy. And to validate that, I went to Nigeria and I met the Ghana's High Commissioner to Nigeria who had lived in India. And the wife is a teacher in Ghana. So he said, Ghana, what happened this year? Your exams has changed. I said, what's going on? He said, my wife called me and told me that the Ghana's exam is just like that of India this year. So I was so happy. I got a validation. So for us to do well on PISA, you have to look at your national assessment. See, so if you go to PISA and don't do well, you are not PISA-like. So our national standardized test, we brought psychometrists from Australia. They look at the PISA exams, and they incorporated a number of PISA-like questions to make it PISA-like. So if they do on the national exams, it tells me we can go to PISA and we'll be able to do well. We want to conquer the world, but we are starting.
So thank you very much. So we just want to get a picture. So Jeffrey, I think they want you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stay in your seats. We're going to transition to the next session.